That is such a good line. I'm totally stealing that. That the internet's just a way to make it go faster. That's brilliant. Thank you. You'll be hearing that on NPR. So thanks very much for having me here. Thank you, Stefan, for making it all happen. Yes, I've written this book about social media and the idea that it's a very old thing and not, as we are encouraged to think of it, new and shiny and completely historically unprecedented. I don't think it is. I think actually it's been around for a long time, and that means it can be. We can look at history and we can learn about it. We can learn some unexpected lessons from it. So, in order to make this claim, I need to really define what I mean by social media. So, what do I mean by social media? I think this is the sort of crucial aspect of social media. It's horizontal two-way transmission rather than vertical one-way transmission. And I can say that to an audience like this, but this is what I normally have to say. It's crucially media we get from other people, and it travels along social networks, and it results in the creation of a distributed community or discussion. So you can feel part of a group with other people who are not physically present by exchanging media with them. So that means I'm not including word of mouth, I'm including anything that involves writing or copying of media. So clearly this is something we can do on the internet, and we know what the network topology of that looks like. But it turns out that this is something that you don't need a digital network to do. And I would contend that social media environments have in fact existed for centuries. So what do you need to have a social media environment? I think you need to have, obviously, literacy, because in order to read and write the messages you're passing around, you need to be literate. But you also need the cost of copying them and delivering them to be sufficiently low. And I think the situation where that combination first arose was in the late Roman Republic. Copying and delivering information was cheap then. It's cheap for us now because of broadband. It was cheap then because of slavery. And so slavery was the Roman broadband. And this is a Roman couple from actually the 1st century AD, but around that time. And this is a mural from Pompeii. And that chap on the right is a guy called Terentius Neo, and he was a baker in Pompeii. And that's his wife there. And this is a mural from their house. And he is holding a scroll. And this is the label on the scroll, this bit here. So when you had lots of scrolls on a shelf, it was like the spine of a book. It was how you could identify them. And she is holding what looks like a Samsung Galaxy Note 3, but is in fact a Roman wax tablet sort of notepad thing. And what seems to be the case is that he is the baker and she actually runs the books and runs the business. So they are saying in this mural, look at us, we are literate. That is, they're proud of their literacy. And they are members of the Roman middle class. They're not members of the elite, but this shows you that literacy was quite widespread among both men and women. But it's among the Roman elite that we really see the social media system working, because they've got, a rich noble would have actually several slaves on his staff who were just messengers, and their job was to just run around delivering and collecting messages on his behalf. And so really big families had their own essentially private postal services, and they could have messages taken wherever they want. And they would also have scribes, so they could have documents copied very quickly. And if we look at the letters of Cicero, which is the best preserved set of correspondence from this period, and interestingly we have his inbox and his outbox, we can see how the Roman social media system worked. And so this is an example from a letter of Cicero's. I sent you on March 24th a copy of Balbus's letter to me and of Caesar's letter to him. And this is a letter that Cicero is writing, I think, to his friend Atticus. So if you think about what's happening here, Balbus has written to Cicero, and Cicero is copying that letter to Atticus. But Caesar has also written to Balbus. And Balbus has copied that letter to Cicero, and Cicero is now copying it to Atticus. So this is a third-level retweet, basically. And this is what people did. This is what they did with their letters. And the reason they did was that the Roman elite was a bunch of intermarried families, and the political news and the social news were very tangled up, because if two families fell out, that could actually mean civil war. And if two families formed an alliance, that would change the political landscape, and that might be cemented with a marriage. But then if there was a divorce, that would mean that potentially there was a ruction and there was going to be political fallout. So what we see is all of these members of the Roman elite writing to each other, and we see some quite fawning letters that Cicero writes to other people to remind them that he's their friend when he's in trouble, and then other people writing to him when he's on top and they're worried about their positions. And so the social and the political political are very closely mixed together. Here's another example. On this occasion, Cicero has written a letter criticizing Caesar, and he's put it into general circulation. So he's sent copies of it to many of his friends, and they've copied it and passed it on. And he's also kept, because he kept copies of everything he sent, he would have kept the rough copies, and his scribe would then make the neat copies to send out. He says that he's actually allowed people who've said, "I've heard you've written a really scorching letter about Caesar, can I have a copy of it?" So this is what he's allowing to happen here. And the same would happen with speeches. So if you were a Roman and you gave a speech and you were particularly proud of it, you would put copies of it in circulation so that even people who hadn't been able to hear you make the speech could read it. And in fact, more people might then read the speech than had actually seen you deliver the speech. And Roman books were also propagated in this way. A book would be a set of rolls in a box. And if you were a Roman author, you would choose the wealthiest, most influential patron that you could. Actually, you would choose the patron who had the most foot traffic going through his library. And you would then have the book put in his library, you'd dedicate it to him, and you would hope that the people passing through the library would read it and be so impressed that they would ask for a copy of it. And at that point, he would get his scribes to make a copy. And this is why the slaves and the scribes are like broadband. The marginal cost per page is 0 at this point, because he's paid for the slave, and he's paying for the upkeep of the slave in the same way that you pay your broadband bill every month. And so you can have as many pages copied out as you like, you just have to wait for them to download. So this is why it's like broadband. And so the books would then spread from one library to another. And if you were really successful, you could tell you'd made it as a Roman author. If you went to the booksellers' street in Rome and you saw copy of your book on sale, that would mean that enough people were going to the booksellers and saying, "Have you got the new Thomas Standages?" And eventually they would find somebody who had it and make some copies so that they could sell them. So they would only do that if there was sufficient demand. So books were propagating socially. But my favourite example is the way the news circulated in this sort of official gazette, and it was called the Acta Diurna. It was founded by Julius Caesar in 59 BC, and as someone who works in news media, that means he sort of founded our industry, which is quite funny. This was a summary of the debates that had happened in the Senate and in the People's Assembly each day, and it was also a roundup of births, deaths, marriages and divorces, because those were politically very important, and announcements of public holidays, the gladiator results, that kind of stuff. And this newspaper was produced each day, but bizarrely by sort of traditions of the newspaper industry, the circulation was apparently rather low. Only one copy of it was made, and it was put up in the forum. And if you wanted to read it, you had to go to the forum and read it yourself. Or if you were a wealthy noble and you had a scribe, you could send a scribe down to copy down the bits that were most relevant to you, and then you could read it over breakfast, and you would do that using a device that looked like this. And this is a Roman iPad. And this is exactly the size and the shape and the aspect ratio of a modern iPad. You'll notice, Google folks, that it's not 16:9. So the Romans decided that a big bevel, which Apple's apparently about to get rid of, and 4:3 was the way to go. Anyway, they also had the smaller ones we saw early on, which is this sort of thing. These were things you could note stuff down on, but I'll go back to the Roman iPad there. So you could then read the news on this, and then you would send the news that you thought would interest your friends to them in a letter. And we see this, we see it in the letters of Pliny, Pliny the Elder, and also in the letters of Cicero, and Tacitus talks about this as well, that when a Roman was outside Rome, they would expect their friends to keep them abreast of the news by sending them the most relevant parts of the Acta, and in some cases, in fact, entire copies of the Acta Diurna transcribed. That way they could keep up with what was happening. But they didn't just want the raw content of the Acta, they wanted the discussion and the commentary and the analysis that their friends would provide around it as well. So the Romans were using their friends to sift the news and deliver the news. There was a social distribution system for all of this stuff, because of course there was no broadcast, there was no printing press. That was the only way you could actually do it. And this seems to have worked very well. We can tell that news from Rome would get to Britain in the west and to Syria in the east in about 5 or 6 weeks. And that's really not bad. So news would propagate in from the provinces to Rome, and then would be also distributed from the centre outwards. And there were boats going to and fro, and Seneca is very amusing. He writes about how some people were so obsessed with getting their mail that they would, when they saw the ships coming in from Egypt with the mail, they would rush down to the harbour, and he would sit there and sort of laugh at them in the same way that people who are addicted to their blackberries are mocked, or used to be when anyone had blackberries. And this is a sort of being hooked on the dopamine rush of getting your mail is something that even the Romans were mocking. Probably the most effective user of the Roman social media system was the Apostle Paul, and he used it to distribute epistles. And if you think about epistles, they're letters. This is a classic example of how Roman letters were passed around. And so this is what Paul says in his letter to the Colossians. So he's got this network of churches across Asia Minor and Greece, and he's writing to them all, and he's encouraging them to read out the letters in church, and then to copy them to local churches, and also to get copies of the letters that he's written to those churches. And what happens is that all the churches end up with a set of all the letters that he's written, and they end up being made into part of the New Testament. And by doing this, what he's doing is binding together this community of churches. He's making them feel like a distributed group that are connected to each other, and they hear about one of the churches being persecuted, and they're invited to pray for the members of that church. And he resolves matters of doctrine and answers questions, and that's something that they're all interested in and they all want to hear about. So he helps to form the Christian church in the 1st century AD using social media. And the social distribution of his epistles is still going on today in churches on Sundays when the epistle is read out. That is the same social distribution system still in action, which is something that's been going on for a very long time. And in fact, what Paul's doing is he's arguing at this stage with other members of the early church who think that Christianity should be just for Jews. And he's arguing that no, it should be open to everyone, and because he essentially runs the more effective social media campaign, he prevails, which is why Christianity ends up being an open religion in the way that it did. So this is, as far as I can see, the first example of a social media system. You've got enough literacy, you've got enough it's cheap enough to copy and deliver information, and so you get social media first in the Roman world. And what I do in the book is I look at many other examples of this, so I'll touch on a couple of others. So here's the second one. This is 1500 years later. Again, it involves the Christian church. But instead of using social media to reinforce the church, this is Martin Luther using it to actually split the church. That wasn't his initial intention. Initially, he just wanted to have a debate about the doctrine of indulgences, and these are sort of tickets that the Catholic Church would sell you to get out of purgatory after you died. And the idea was that if you gave them some money to help them build, in this case, St. Peter's, Rome, that giant cathedral, they would then give you a ticket that would mean that when you died, you wouldn't have to spend so long in purgatory. And Luther thought this all sounded a bit silly, because the salespeople were saying, you could also buy tickets for your already dead relatives who were presumably stuck in purgatory at that point, and you'd be able to release them straight away. And they were playing rather fast and loose with this doctrine. So Luther drew up a list of problems he had with this. If he'd done it these days, he'd have done it, I'm sure, as a listicle. It would have been on BuzzFeed, 95 crazy questions the Pope must answer about indulgences. But of course it wasn't. It was 1518, so he didn't do that. Instead, he wrote them in Latin, and he pinned them to the door of the church in Wittenberg, where he was a theologian, and this was the notice board for the university. So he was inviting people to come and have a debate with him about this. But this was so explosive that people started to copy down the theses and circulate them to their friends. These are the theses of that he wanted to debate, the 95 theses. And so far this sounds like a Roman distribution system. You've got people copying stuff down in Latin and sending it to their friends, manuscript form. But of course what's happened since the Roman period is the printing press has been invented, and so eventually some printers get hold of this and they print them, and you print 1,000 copies, so that's a very big increase in the number of copies in circulation. Those copies get carried to other towns. The printers there get hold of it, they print it. Some of the printers translate this into German so that more people can read it. And the result is that these 95 propositions, written in, frankly, very impenetrable theological Latin, spread very, very quickly. And a contemporary of Luther's says that, in fact, it took 2 weeks for the theses to spread throughout the whole of Germany, and only a month for the rest of continental Europe. So this was extraordinary. And it was a complete surprise to Luther. He wasn't expecting to do this. He said, the theses are printed and circulated far beyond my expectation. But he realized this presented him with an opportunity. If he wanted to take his message about problems with the corruption of the Catholic Church and the need to reform it to the people, he could use this mechanism. So he followed up with a series of pamphlets, mostly written in German, and in a very easy to understand German that avoided any sort of dialectic, regional dialects. And he would simply take the text of one of these pamphlets that he would write and give it to a printer in his town, and they would print 1,000 copies, and then those copies would ripple to other towns, and printers there would print them as well, and they would spread and spread in this way. And he didn't have to do anything. The audience was sufficiently interested in his message that they amplified it themselves. And the printers were sort of special supernodes who could make this amplification much, much more efficient. And so you can measure how effectively his campaign worked. Today we measure social media campaigns by how many +1s or likes or retweets or reblogs or repins they get. But for Luther, it was the number of reprints by printers that's the really crucial thing. And it turns out you can do Martin Luther's traffic stats. And it looks like this. And this shows you have a great big spike in traffic in 1523, which is the height of the Reformation, where you've got of the order of 350 reprints of 1,000, maybe 2,000 copies of these pamphlets. What's happening here is that the blue pamphlets are Latin ones and the red ones are German ones, and the dark bits are the number of new pamphlets that Martin Luther is issuing each year, and the light ones are the number of reprints. So you can see mostly what he's doing is writing in German, but he did write some in Latin because he was also addressing a theological audience to whom he wrote in Latin. But you can see that the retweets of existing pamphlets are sort of more important than the number of actual pamphlets that he's putting out. And overall, there were something like 5 to 7 million pamphlets by Luther and others floating around Europe within the first 10 years of the Reformation. And the result was the splitting of Western Christendom and the emergence of Protestant churches and Protestant Christianity. So this is the result of a social media campaign that is helped along by improvements in the technology of propagation, in this case printing. Here's another example very dear to me, which is coffee houses. And coffee houses were particularly popular in England, and they became popular in the second half of the 17th century. And coffee houses were media sharing platforms. You went to them because they had all sorts of things to read. So this is an example on the right of what a pamphlet would look like. And again, pamphlets are very often written in the form of letters, even if they weren't actually letters to real people. So this is a letter from a gentleman in Kent to a friend in London, and this is a literary device just to say a particular thing about what's going on. But it was the sort of thing you'd find in coffee houses, where you could go and you would find a very free conversation, and you could read all manner of printed news. And so there'd be news books, which are the precursors of newspapers. There would be pamphlets. There would be handwritten newsletters that were called letters of news. And these were gathered by the precursors of journalists, so people who went around listening and talking and exchanging gossip, and then they'd write it down, and they would send these letters of news to paying subscribers in the countryside. And again, that's quite a Roman sort of way of doing things. So you could find all of these things in the coffee house, and you could discuss stuff with people, and it was a very alluring information environment. And we see this from the diary of Samuel Pepys. He often says, "So thence to the coffee house." And he tells you all the sorts of amazing people he would meet and things he would learn. That he would meet a merchant from the South Seas who had seen people who'd learnt to write with their feet, or there's a new kind of fruit called a pineapple, or that sort of thing. And so it was a very alluring information environment. In fact, some people thought it was too alluring, and that people were spending too much of their time just hanging out in coffee houses, networking, sharing gossip with their friends. So it's a very sort of recognisably modern environment. And one of the reasons that it was that people were encouraged to mix socially in a way that they otherwise normally wouldn't. So there was a convention of politeness in coffee houses, and a convention that you would leave distinctions of social class behind as you entered them. So you would enter, you would pay a penny for a dish of coffee, and that was the kind of admission price, and then you could join in the conversation. And the idea was, it's a contemporary description, gentleman, mechanic, lord and scoundrel mix, and all are of a piece. What this means is that ideas were able to cross social boundaries in a way that they previously couldn't have done. And so this was what made going to a coffee house so exciting, that you never knew, the serendipity was part of the attraction. You never knew who you might meet or what you might learn. And I have many more examples in the book. This is a commonplace book. Commonplace books were notebooks where you would write down cool stuff. And it might be a poem that you'd been sent by a friend, a new sonnet by Shakespeare perhaps, or an aphorism. Maybe you were reading one of the classics and there's a particularly good quote from Cicero or from Tacitus or something like that, and you think, oh, that's great, I'm going to write that down in my commonplace book. And that way, when you wanted to remember it later, you'd know that it was in your commonplace book. And then you might also write a letter to a friend saying, by the way, I came across this really great quote today, and they would then, if they thought it was awesome as well, they would copy it into their commonplace book. And sometimes people would exchange commonplace books, or there were sometimes shared commonplace books within families, within groups of friends, where people would write these things down and write poems and comment on each other's stuff. And this looks to me very similar to what we see with say, Tumblr and Pinterest, where 80% of the content circulating on those networks is reblogs or repins of other people's stuff. So it's self-expression through the curation of other people's content. And some of what you post is original, but actually the vast majority is the selection of other people's stuff. So that's quite a striking parallel, I think, with the way some social platforms work today. And there are others as well. I talk about pamphlets in the English Civil War, the circulation of poetry in the Tudor court, the circulation of pamphlets in the run-up to the American Revolution, the circulation of poems on tiny slips of paper in the run-up to the French Revolution. And all of these have characteristics that are very similar to different aspects of social media today. So the idea then is that this has all got a much deeper and richer history than we might think. So what happened to it? Why is it that we've failed to notice this before? Well, I think the reason is that we had this big shift that took place in the 19th century, where we went from this sort of network topology to this sort of thing. Essentially, machines were invented starting with the steam press and later the radio and TV transmitters that made it possible to deliver information, a single message, to a large audience very, very efficiently. And this changed the way that information travelled. People still wrote each other letters and exchanged information socially, but this was so much more efficient that more of their media diet came from these centralised one-way broadcast sources. If you look at newspapers, at the beginning of the 19th century, the average circulation of a newspaper was 1,000 or 2,000. They were very, very local, and they were essentially local social platforms. Most of what was in newspapers was letters sent in by readers, reports of speeches and so on. It was not articles written by professional journalists. And what happens by the end of the 19th century is that steam presses make it possible to have newspapers with 1 million copies being produced a day. And what this does, because the equipment needed to do this, to reach a large audience, is so expensive, gradually the scale of these platforms goes up and the barrier to entry gets bigger and bigger. This means that the access to that technology, the ability to send your thoughts to lots of people, is concentrated into the hands of a very small number of people, journalists, opinion leaders, politicians. And most people are not participating in the system other than to be recipients of information. And I think the most sort of infamous example of this is the Nazi Volksempfänger. So we've heard of the Volkswagen, the people's car. This is the people's receiver. And the Nazis recognized the power of radio to impress their view of the world on the German people. And the Volksempfänger was deliberately designed not to be able to pick up foreign broadcasts. So all you could listen to was the Führer banging on. Ganz Deutschland hört den Führer. So the whole of Germany hears the Führer. And you can see there they all are gathered symbolically around this radio. This is as far away from a social media distribution as it's possible to get. This is a single man imposing his view of the world on an entire nation. This is one way, and it's as unequal as it's possible to be. But of course, what's happened in the past 10 years is that the internet has massively reduced the cost of delivering information to large audiences. So it's now possible for social distribution systems to compete with broadcast and with mass media in a way that it previously couldn't. And we can see information diets shifting. We can see people are spending less time watching TV and reading newspapers and more time on social platforms, getting their friends to filter interesting stuff towards them. And there are lots of surveys of young people showing that they don't read newspapers at all. And my children don't watch television, they kind of watch YouTube. And a lot of what they watch on YouTube is user-generated content made by people like them for people like them. So I think this means we need to look at the history of media in a rather different way. We're used to thinking of it like this, where we had old media, which was analog and broadcast, and then the internet came along and we had new media, and it was digital and it was more social in nature. And this is only part of the picture. I think if we look at the last 2,000 years, it looks more like this. We need to have this period of really old media, because old media is not really that old. I have the arbitrary date of 1833 here because that's the year that the first penny newspaper was launched, the New York Sun. And it was the first newspaper that adopted the new mass media model where most of the money came from advertisers, not subscribers, and you used the fact that you had a large audience to appeal to the advertisers who then gave you the money. And to bootstrap that model, the founder of the New York Sun did a rather clever thing. Instead of selling his newspaper at 6 cents like everyone else, he sold it at 1 cent, which means he'd lose money. So he copied adverts from other newspapers and put them in, and then he went to all the advertisers and said, look, all of these other companies are advertising, maybe you should, and they all fell for it and signed up. So that was how he bootstrapped the model, and that model worked very nicely, thank you, for the media industry until just a few years ago. At the peak in 2007, an average American newspaper got 87% of its revenue from advertising. But that turned out to be unsustainable, and they're now all having to find new models. So I think we need to look at it like this, and we have to recognise that there was this very long period of really old media, which in many ways was similar to new media. And what new media has done is brought back the spirit of the coffee house and the other social platforms that were around before the advent of mass media. So that means, I think, given that similarity between really old media and new media, that ancient social media systems have lessons for us today. Many of the questions that we have about social media today actually arose in conjunction with these ancient social media systems as well. So I think that can be quite informative. And again, in the book, I look at several examples of this, but I'm just going to touch on 3 of them now that relate to the 3 examples that I gave you earlier on. So the Romans, Luther, and coffee houses. So let's start with this one. Is social media merely a dangerous distraction that wastes time? And this is a very common critique of social media today, in particular the idea that social networking should really be called social not working, and it's a sort of way of avoiding work rather than a way of doing anything useful. And this turns out to be a timeless complaint. So this is Oxford in the 1670s. Anthony Wood, who is an academic at Oxford, is very worried about the fact that solid and serious learning is in decline. And the students are not actually doing any work anymore because they're in coffee houses all the time. And this is not just in Oxford. Meanwhile, in Cambridge, hours are spent in talking and less profitable reading of newspapers. Scholars are so greedy after news, they neglect all for it. And another pamphlet from the period warns that coffee houses are great enemies to diligence and industry, the ruin of many serious and hopeful young gentlemen and tradesmen. And so this is all quite a modern-sounding critique of these very alluring platforms. They're so alluring that people go in there and don't realise what's happened, and hours later they emerge realising that the afternoon has disappeared. But this turned out to be exactly wrong. If you look at what coffee houses actually did in the late 17th century, they turned out to be, rather than enemies of diligence and industry, they turned out to be crucibles of innovation. Because of this mixing of ideas and people who had previously not been able to encounter each other, this was a really, really fantastic place to come up with new ideas, new ventures, whether that was joint stock companies, whether it was the scientific revolution. The Royal Society came out of meetings held in coffee houses by scientists. Isaac Newton writes Principia Mathematica, the foundation stone of modern science, in order to settle a coffee house argument between Hooke, Halley and Wren about the nature of the inverse square law of gravity and its relationship to the shapes of orbits. Lloyd's of London starts off as a coffee house where marine shippers meet and discuss insurance, and then they realise that this is something they're all interested in. You have Lloyd's List pinned to the wall. It turns into Lloyd's of London. Goes from coffee house to insurance market. Similarly, there's another coffee house called Jonathan's where all the stock traders would meet. That turns into the London Stock Exchange. So all of this innovation comes out of coffee houses because they're very fertile environments where people and ideas can mix. And I think there's a lesson for us there that social media offers us similar opportunities within companies, between companies, and as scientists or individuals or artists, that we can encounter people and exchange ideas and come up with new cool stuff as a result of it. Second question. So again, this is a very sort of current question. The role of social media in revolutions, and how to what extent were Facebook and Twitter factors in causing the Arab Spring and all this sort of thing. Well, it turns out this is also a very old debate, and we can ask Martin Luther. Martin Luther says, "From the rapid spread of the theses, I gather what the greater part of the nation thinks of indulgences." So this is a phenomenon that media scholars call synchronization of opinion. If you were Luther and you saw your pamphlets spreading like wildfire, one description was that they were more seized than sold. So people really couldn't wait to get their hands on them. Then that told you that there was quite a lot of support for your views. And more importantly, if you were one of the readers of one of Luther's pamphlets, pamphlets were quite accessible. They cost about the same as a chicken. So they were much, much less expensive than buying a book, which was like buying a car. So they really were accessible to ordinary people. And if you went to the printer in your town and said, "I hear there's a new Martin Luther, have you got a copy?" And the printer said, "No, sold out," then you knew that lots of other people in your town were interested in what Luther had to say and probably agreed with you that he was onto something. And so this was how people across Europe were able to recognize that their views about the nature of the Catholic Church and corruption in the higher echelons of the Catholic Church was shared by large numbers of other people. And that's ultimately what enabled the Reformation to get going. And so I think the way of thinking about this, and we saw the same with the Arab Spring, where previous efforts by governments had been successful to stifle outbursts of local dissent, local protests. But social media eventually allowed people in one part of Tunisia to tell people in the rest of Tunisia what was going on. And then people across Tunisia could say, well, hang on a minute, we all think that this isn't on. And then you actually get change. And so I think the way that you should think about this is that social media doesn't actually trigger or start revolutions. There's an underlying grievance in both cases here about the corruption of the Catholic Church or of the despotic leaders in various Arab countries. That's the ultimate cause. And once there's a spark, social media synchronizes opinion and allows the protest to spread much more quickly. So it's like an accelerant. It doesn't start a fire. It enables it to spread more quickly. This is Jared Cohen's idea, a Google person, and I think he's put his finger on it by saying it's the accelerant is the right way of thinking about it. Finally, is social media a fad? Well, I hope that my very brief tour of 2,000 years of it has convinced you that actually this is a very old idea with very deep roots and a very rich history. If we go back to this chart here, you can see that actually it's old media that is the historical anomaly here. This was just a consequence of the fact that technologies to propagate information really quickly to large audiences used to be really expensive. And they used to be only available to a small number of people. And there were business models you could build around that to do with scarcity and local monopolies, but they don't work anymore, as we've seen what's happened to the newspaper industry in particular. So that was the anomaly, and really new media and its similarity to really old media is a sort of reversion to the way things used to be. So I don't think this is a fad at all, and think historically, the broadcast era was the sort of faddish bit. It was the historical anomaly. So I think that means that we, users of social media today, are heirs to a centuries-long tradition, even if we didn't realize it. And what I've tried to do is sort of put our use of social media today in historical context. And there are these very direct parallels between the sorts of social media we use today and the sorts that existed in the past, like this. So I hope I've convinced you that social media doesn't just connect us to each other today, it also links us to the past. Thank you. Oh, and this is my book on the subject. This is what it looks like.
So I was wondering what lessons you can draw from the really old media in terms of something else you mentioned, which was the business models for newspapers that have kind of become obsolete now.
Well, I think what all media companies are struggling with now is how they make sharing their friend. And we saw in the music industry was hit first by this. And the model that the music industry has sort of ended up with is that the emphasis on selling music, that's going to be a much smaller part of their revenues in future, and much more of it is going to come from basically tickets to live events and merchandise and so on. So there's been that shift there. Similarly, newspapers are shifting away from advertising funded models to subscription funded models. Some of them can do advertising funded, but they can't, the number of papers, the number of publications that model will sustain is, because they're all competing globally, is nothing like as big as it used to be. But my favorite example is actually the Asian video game model, where instead of the consoles and selling the games and the licensing fees, the model that we have in the West, you have the model of distributing the client software, and you actually want as many copies of it to be made as possible and to be as easy as possible to download it. And then you get a very large number of people playing a game, and it's free to play. And then you sell the in-game upgrades, and that's where your model comes from. So this is a model that works. The more widely your client software is pirated, the better it works. And I think what we're all trying to do in different parts of the industry is work out, how we make sharing our friends in our particular industry.
So, for every person that creates something great based on social media, or every group of people that does, there's the average person where it is genuinely just a big time suck, and they're not going to create like the next Principia Mathematica. So are there any lessons we can glean from the really old media model to increase the the amount of great things that come from social media?
Well, one of the timeless complaints about media, whenever technology makes it easier to distribute stuff, is that there's then too much, and that the wrong people are publishing the wrong thing. So we see this now about the trivialization, the coarsening of debate, and one man's trivialization is another man's democratization. And if we look at what happened, so Erasmus is complaining around the time of Luther that there are all these pamphlets flying around. They're really short. They're in German, so they're really easy to read, and this means no one's reading the classics in Latin and Greek anymore, which he thinks is a big, terrible. So it's very similar to sort of modern complaints that as media becomes easier to consume and more people have access to it, that it's a bad thing. But if you look at what happened, and then there was a sort of huge increase in the number of books that were published, and people felt very overwhelmed by it, and people feel overwhelmed by what's happening now. But what actually happened in the case of printing, the last big step change here, was that people figured out mechanisms, technologies, to cope and to sift the good stuff from the bad. So things like, in the case of books, book reviews and tables of contents and bibliographies and indexes. And what all of those things are is they are ways to figure out whether a particular book is relevant to what you're doing, and to find the bits that are relevant to you quickly without having to read, because you can't possibly read all books about everything. And we're used to that now, that we're never going to be able to read all books. So instead we rely on these other mechanisms to identify the good stuff. And I think that's what we're going to have we've obviously seen this with the internet. We had the Yahoo directory model, that was great for a while. Then we had the search engine model, that's also got its merits. Now we seem to be in a world where we're using social as part of the filtering process, and there's this combination of search and social that Google's doing as well. So I think all of this is the process by which we determine where the valuable stuff is. And what's really good about these versions of it is that it's capable of producing different answers for different people. So what I think is the really cool stuff will be different from what you think is the really cool stuff. But as far as I'm concerned, this is the task you are all engaged in, which is helping people find the, organising the world's information. And so what you're doing is part of this very, very long historical continuum of what people have been trying to do before.
What are your thoughts on the rate of information delivery and how that's changed and maybe affected attention spans or anything like that?
Well, certainly the analogy isn't perfect in the sense that the internet is, global, instant, searchable, and maybe permanent. We don't know how permanent it is. So the analogy, though, I think is close enough to be informative because we see the same social reactions. And my thesis is, in all of my writing about the history of technology, that our brains are still running the same Stone Age software, and different technologies come and go and just push the same buttons in our brains. So Twitter pushes the same button for me as coffeehouses did for Samuel Pepys. So in that sense, I'm sort of arguing that the rate of change doesn't. People have always complained about this before. A good example would be the step change in the rate of information that occurred with the telegraph in the 19th century. If you look at how stockbrokers used to deal with their clients, you might meet your stockbroker once a year or maybe twice a year, and you might say, I'm going to sell tea and I'm going to buy gold, and what do you think will happen to the price of tea in the next 6 months? And then the telegraph meant that you could have multiple price updates every day globally, and stockbrokers were really not terribly impressed by this because it meant that they had to work a lot harder. They were always getting messages to buy and sell this, that and the other, and they thought this was a big problem. But of course then the next generation of stockbrokers thought this was totally normal and got used to it. So we actually see this pattern again and again, and we see the complaint that attention spans are getting shorter. We particularly see it with the telegraph, actually, that it makes people nervous, that we only skim the surface of things, that it leads to politicians speaking in sound bites. These are all actually complaints that arrive in the 19th century. So they're not actually new, and the world didn't end then. People got used to it. So I think that tells us that we'll just get used to it again. We'll have to find and identify and create these coping mechanisms, some of which are technological, like tables of contents or search engines, and some of which are social technologies, customs about how we should and should not use things. But that's what's particularly bewildering about this, living through a period where we're still figuring out our answers to those questions.
I was just looking at your timeline and wanting to go back the other way.
All right.
I think you can add two more giant blocks of time to that view, which is the Dark Ages, which was a very centralized media from the church world. There's a 1,000-year block where it wasn't the old media.
So what's the other block?
And the block before that was, the age of pyramids and ziggurats. Again,
Right, yes.
strong central control.
Oh, yes, I see what you mean. I suppose it depends what you mean by the consumption of media. So most people aren't consuming it at all in the Dark Ages. You've got
well, there's the church.
yes, you've got monks writing stuff out, and then you've got the pulpit as a sort of quasi-broadcast medium. Yes, but I think most people are not. Where are they getting? They're just not consuming media at all. So the actual, so it's very hard to work out what the balance of distributed versus centralized versus social media is. I should also stress this is a very much Western-centric view. I have been looking for non-Western examples, and there are some quite nice cases of social poetry in 10th and 11th century Japan, for example. And what I'm hoping will happen is that the publication of this book will sort of flush out some more examples, and I'll be able to broaden it. Going back to the period before the Romans, I think basically the literacy rates were very low. If you look at, there are examples of there are a couple I have in the book where there are scribes in Egypt who have a sort of poetry club, and they send each other poems. But there are really very, very few examples of it because literacy is so restricted. And in fact, in Egypt, the scribes deliberately avoided adopting the much more efficient technology of the alphabet because they wanted it to be hard to read and write, because they wanted to preserve their special status as people who could do it. And so they actually fought against this far more efficient way of doing things. So that's why I think it really starts with the Romans, where you have a reasonably widespread use of media by ordinary people, and then they're sharing it in this social way.
Yeah, the Library of Alexandria comes to mind. Also, the retrieving of the Buddhist sutras from India and the spread of Buddhism along the Silk Road is another.
So the retrieval of, so that's involving written documents.
Written documents.
Oh,
yes.
Brilliant! There you go. So this is the kind of thing that is being flushed out. So hurrah! That's what I want to find. Thank you.
You were saying that, like, if your book was copied or your letter was copied, and that mean like that's like retweeting. And now, people, whenever they publish something, or if your YouTube video gets a lot of views, then you're theoretically making more money. But that didn't seem to be part of it, because like if that happened today, right, there'd be all this copyright. Oh my gosh, people are selling my book. So was there not? I mean, were people not trying to earn money? Like, there's definitely some difference there. I'm not.
Yeah, no, that's true. So copyright's a relatively modern idea. It goes back to the beginning of the 18th century, and so Roman authors didn't expect to be able to make money, because they knew that the only way to get their book out there was unrestricted copying by the audience, and that was so they couldn't imagine any other way of doing it, and they wrote books with a view to becoming more famous, winning patronage, getting a nice job. And that was how they benefited from them. So that clearly is a different way of doing things. What then later happens with printing is that pamphleteers would be paid little or nothing to write pamphlets. They would be paid in the form of copies of their pamphlet that they could give to people. And again, it was a patronage thing. So it's rather like the deal I have with WordPress, which is that I don't pay them, but I give them content, and then they give me distribution. So I'm paid back in the ability to reach an audience. So that's quite a similar model. And then this idea that you own stuff and you have a right to kind of make money from it is actually quite recent. And as we can see, it's now become harder to enforce than it used to be. So that sort of ownership of content is very much a mass media way of looking at the world. And we do see people asking, how do you look beyond that? Should you have your music on Spotify and then make money, which you hardly make anything from at all, and then make money from other things if you're a musician? And to what extent, Cory Doctorow gives away his books as ebooks, and we're all trying to work out what the sort of new models are around that. But there were people in the past who managed to make a living from doing things in a sort of indirect way. So maybe we can borrow some of their models.
I haven't read the book, so I'm not sure if there's a chapter talk about the culture different, like West, East different,
right,
in terms of the influence of the social media evolution. And also
no, it's I only consider Western.
Western,
so I'm aware of a few examples in Asia, but I don't feel I can see into the literature there. So I don't think I have a sort of I'm very aware of the limitations of my understanding of that. So I'd be grateful for any suggestions you have.
Yeah.
So how do you see the difference in the attitude towards those?
I'm from China. At least, even I don't know too much on the old media what's that phase, but even in the current phase, right after 2000, there's no social network, but there's a similar, Facebook, Twitter, like that. But they all kind of run, differently. At least it's not truly distributed. Still have a little bit censored and the government control. So that's kind of a very hybrid model, and then.
Well, yes, I mean, to be honest, one of the striking things about social networking in the West as well today is that it's extremely centralized and it's run by private companies. So we treat it as though it's a public sphere, but it's not really. It's not a town square. It's more like a mall. It's privately owned, and if Facebook doesn't like something that you say or whatever, they can shut down your page. But again, I think there's a historical analogy there, which is if you look at what happened to AOL and CompuServe, they were swept away by the open standards of web publishing. And I wonder whether the same is true for social media. I mean, there have been various attempts to build open distributed standards for social media, but it seems weird that I can set up my own web server or my own email server, but I have to go to Facebook or Twitter or Google to do social networking. So that's one of the things I'm very interested to see how that changes, because that may be a historical anomaly. It's just that doing timely, in-order delivery of social streams is really, really hard and distributed. I mean, Usenet used to do this, and it didn't do it terribly well. It was very slow, and so there are advantages to a centralized model, but there are drawbacks as well.
Yeah, so there's a concept called we media. So is that, you can comment, we media, I think at least in China now it's pretty popular. They just set up some site and then public, some journalism just quit their job and run some site themselves.
Right. Well, it's still a centralized site then. I mean, I think we need a sort of equivalent to IMAP or HTTP that does establishing social connections, basically friend connections, status updates, that sort of stuff. And there have been various attempts to do it. The most recent one was called tent.io, which was quite clever, I thought. But it's hard to see how any of these things can get off the ground because you need to get the ball rolling, and the existing networks have such a big advantage because they have these massive advantages of scale. So I don't know, but it happened with the web, so maybe it can happen.
Thanks.
Thank you. Great. Well, thank you all very much, and it's great to be here. Thank you.